On one side of it.
So I will get as far as I can. Then the plan is, Friday, we're gonna watch the 80s. And then on, then we have Memorial Day, Monday. And then the presidents, our last day of regular class is June 4th. So the presidents will be on the 2nd or 3rd. We just kind of see how it times out. 2nd or 3rd of June.
What's your favorite day? Just
All of them. Okay, so let's go ahead then, and we got to Watergate, didn't we? We got to Watergate, right?
That's what Paris East talks, maybe Michigan.
Oh, so we didn't finish Paris peace talks?
No. We got.
Did we get the election of 72?
Yes, we did. We got election of 72, Watergate, and then into Paris East talks.
Okay, so let's get back to Watergate. So Nixon was elected in 72, but the Democrats did still control the House and the Senate. And there was the Paris peace talks, peace with honor, even though it was kind of an illusion, but then Watergate blew up again. So Watergate, almost immediately the talk was of impeachment once a taping system. We didn't get a taping system, right? A taping system. Nixon had been taping the Oval Office conversations, and on it, as we now know, there was evidence of Nixon covering it up. He said it was national security, a CIA operation. Nixon would fight for 2 years to keep these tapes top secret. He even tried to issue like a transcript, which had expletive deleted over and over again because they swore so much, which kind of shocked everybody. But it went to the Supreme Court in the court case U.S. versus Nixon. And the Supreme Court in August of 74 ruled that he had to release the tapes. And he actually went on a yacht and sat alone and listened to the tapes and realized on the tape, just give me 1 second, was exact evidence that he had covered it up. He said it. He said, tell the FBI to not investigate because it's a CIA operation. And in 74, he almost certainly would have been impeached and probably convicted because many Republicans were now going to vote against him. That would have given him the 2/3 necessary. He resigned before he would have been impeached and then convicted. But President Ford, the only president in American history who has never been elected, president or vice president, would pardon. And this is a big deal because it basically is telling him that, he's trying to save the country from the divisiveness of a trial. But he was guilty. And he tried to use the power of the presidency to overthrow an election. And the corruption was unreal, especially all these secret funds coming in, and he got off. Pretty much telling future presidents, just don't cater for conversations. And he was not elected because of this. So in 72, Nixon won with his vice president, Spiro Agnew. But in 73, Spiro Agnew resigned because he was found, it came out that he was accepting bribes as governor of Maryland. Literally money in brown paper bags they were bringing in. And so he resigned in 73. The 25th Amendment has a clause in it that the president can appoint a vice president if their vice president resigns and just approved by the Senate, then the next election will have a normal election. Because before the 25th Amendment, if something happens to the vice president, there's no vice president. It goes to the Speaker, House, it's the next in line. So he was a member of the House, he was appointed, and it seemed like a deal was made, but we never know. But Ford will be ever retained by this, and this will also help bring out a conservative revival in the United States. Because so much of the New Deal was trust and faith in the government. And people began to lose faith with the Vietnam War, but then when Watergate hit, faith in the government dropped like a rock. And this is actually Trump's first term, but it's still now incredibly low. Which is kind of fascinating how people have such a bad view of the government, and then at the same time still want certain government programs. It's a fascinating thing to me. But public trust dropped dramatically. So it's always kind of argued that you could say the 70s began with Watergate. And nothing sets the 70s more than really cool fashion. You got to admit, those are pretty sweet duds. Look at those. I had a shirt for it. And I know what you're thinking, and it's true. I made it work.
Is that even so?
No, I wasn't a model for the Montgomery Ward's catalog, which is not even a Montgomery Ward's anymore. I should have. And I will also say that is an outfit, and that's a belt.
That is a belt.
So, part of what dominated the 1970s was massive inflation because of two huge oil shocks. Two different times, oil went up by 400%. The first one, well, actually, there were two oil, in essence, embargoes by OPEC. This is the first time that people began to realize how much oil and how reliant people were on oil coming out of the Persian Gulf. U.S. oil production had been dropping partially because of a glut of oil from the Middle East, and therefore oil prices were relatively low. But when they cut off the Straits of Hormuz and no oil for 2 months, it created a shock that's going to change the entire course of American history. The first one was during the October War of 1973. It's also about the Yom Kippur War. And the oil embargo went on until early 1974. It was an embargo of anybody who supported Israel, and that was the United States. We can't go into details of the Yom Kippur War, but the U.S. sent billions of dollars of aid to Israel. And that is going to lead to oil. It took a while. So, worldwide oil market, all of a sudden about 15% of the oil not being traded. All the oil reserves are going to be used up. It'll take about a month and a half till you're draining the bottom of the barrels. And then what happens? Lines, gas shortages, things like even number license plates on Monday, odd number license plates can fuel up on Tuesday, things like that. Massive oil prices, and that would trigger a worldwide recession. I should add. Oh, this is the oil price. I can remember 40 cents a gallon gas, and all of a sudden it's $1.20. So weird. They had to make new signs for all the gas stations. And in 74, to save gas, Congress mandated that all speed limits in every state must be 55 miles per hour. And it was like that for the next 12 years. The max speed limit in every state was 55 miles per hour. Now, if you're in a big city or areas where there's lots of people, 55 miles per hour is, it's okay. It's relatively close. In Montana, that's pretty noticeable, especially going up in, let's say, eastern Montana. 55 miles per hour is quite the slowdown. Yeah.
Didn't Montana only you can force it?
No, they enforced it,
I heard they.
but it was only a $5 ticket.
Yeah, my dad was saying that, it was just a $5 ticket, and you could just pay the cop right there and just leave.
It was a $5 ticket, which is about 35 now. But $5 ticket, but at night it wasn't. At night it was big. At night it was about $150.
Did you get it to
I've never
$500.
never got it. Maybe a couple.
$500 fine for speeding at night.
And there was one, and for a while there, Montana went for daylight speed limit of safe and prudent.
Yeah.
There was no speed limit. But that's another story.
Autobahn.
But let me add this right now. If there's a shortage of oil, demand prices will keep going up. And if prices keep going up, there's no way to get prices down again unless you cut demand. What's the only way to cut demand? Recession. That's what happened in 74, it happened in 80, and I can't imagine what happened. Just can't even, it's impossible to imagine. Oil's been cut back by 12% in the last 5 weeks. This goes on another 3 or 4 weeks. There's no way. There's just simply no way you can make up for that without a massive economic disaster. I hope not, but it's, it's minor rule of economics. The other was this, the Iranian Revolution in 79. And that one was even bigger because it kind of snowballed to a massive range of speculation about oil prices down the road, which tanked prices for everything. Now, unfortunately for people then, they were more reliant upon gas and oil than we are today. It's a bigger part of the economy. So it might not be as bad as then, but it still could be pretty bad. In fact, waiting in line, okay, that just picture, that cracked me up. Waiting with this mower. I can remember gas lines. So this is a phenomenon that is not supposed to happen. It's called stagflation. High inflation and raising unemployment rate. Here's the 74 inflation and unemployment going up. Normally, if inflation's going up, that means demand is high. This should not happen in traditional economics, except for this oil shock. And yeah, it's kind of happening right now. The Federal Reserve did what the Federal Reserve always did. It raises interest rates. But if you raise interest rates, that cuts back on demand, creating a recession. We're going to have 2 recessions created by high interest rates. And many people begin to question Keynesian and liberal economics. And this will help bring back trickle-down economics. With the idea is Keynes was too stifling. Unleash the economy and give rich people tax breaks, and they will boom the economy. This is the failed effort by the Ford administration to whip inflation. Now, when it did not work, even though in 73 and 74, because beef prices were going up so fast, the Department of Agriculture was saying things to people, way to cut back is to eat more of the delicious sweetmeats, like liver and kidney and spleen and pancreas. I know what you're all saying. That's everyone's favorite, but hey, guess what the Department of Agriculture just said 2 weeks ago? Same thing. Because meat prices are going up so high. So it's amazing how the parallel. But who doesn't like spleen? Right? If you don't like spleen, raise your hand. None of you do. So, while this is going on, South Vietnam collapsed. North Vietnam started, and the Viet Cong did a limited offensive in 74, and it snowballed because South Vietnam collapsed. Ford wanted to send U.S. planes, air power to help, but because of Watergate, the Democrats in Congress said, no way, we've had enough of Vietnam. Here's the panicky retreat of civilians. This is in the city of Hue. It turned into an absolute disaster. The United States spent hundreds of millions of dollars to reinforce the South Vietnamese government, and it collapsed. It folded up. And in 75, Saigon fell. Here are panicky people in Saigon trying to get into the U.S. embassy to be airlifted out because they helped the U.S. government and they expected retribution. And there would be retribution for helping the U.S. or the corrupt South Vietnamese government. Here are North Vietnamese tanks. This one's entering the U.S. embassy after the U.S. had fled. And every time things like this happen, it's chaos. The South Vietnamese government collapsed much faster than anyone thought, and the evacuation turned into a madhouse. In your lifetime, it happened in Afghanistan in 2021. They thought the Afghan government would last at least 6 months. It lasted about 6 hours. And the whole place just collapsed. Despite billions of dollars of aid. The U.S. absolutely and totally humiliated. Now, the U.S. had lost a war before. War of 1812 by no means a victory, but never been so humiliated. It wasn't a horrible long-term defeat. It really wasn't, fortunately for the United States. We could win almost every battle, But it shows the limits of power if you base everything on power on military force and blowing things up. Because eventually you make more enemies and you will probably lose. The US lost. To give you an idea of the weights of the Vietnam War, so the US spent hundreds of millions of dollars equipping South Vietnam with the most modern helicopters. That's a Huey helicopter. That's right there, the South Vietnamese Air Force. So you have all these pilots just taking their helicopters and flying maybe their family and friends to safety to US Navy ships offshore in the South China Sea. This is flying on the Mount Whitney command ship, the US Navy command ship. And this is a couple $1 million helicopter, about 50 million or about $40 million today. They didn't have room for it. The helicopter landed, they had to push it off into the ocean. Just throwing it away. And they did that to about 50 helicopters. And all the other equipment that's just going to be lost and rusting away in South Vietnam today. But this would also help fuel conservative revival. Basically saying that liberals have allowed the Soviets to win, which is kind of fascinating because Lyndon Johnson got the US into this war, but 58,000 US dead, over 300,000 wounded, and that's just noticeable wounds. Not the unseen wounds, PTSD, battle fatigue, they're still calling it. At least 3 million Vietnamese dead. Vietnam says it's closer to 5 million. You're getting numbers so high. An absolute catastrophe. But one of the worst things that happened were all the veterans who came home. This happens after every war. Veterans are mistreated, ignored, but nothing like what happened after Vietnam. After Vietnam, the treatment of veterans was horrific. Just ignored, especially when the Reagan administration cut veterans benefits. It became even worse, but they were ignored. Now, there is a myth that Vietnam veterans were spit upon all over the place and attacked and called names. Individual things happen, but there's no evidence of that. I mean, literally no evidence. Not a picture, not on film. If you want to find this, I'm not kidding. You'll be hard pressed to find an episode of like some hippie spitting on a veteran, unless you find a comic book, because it just didn't happen. But in a way, it was worse. They were just ignored. Just ignored. Nobody wanted to talk about it, which made it even worse. But we see elements of that to this day. So, too many people thought we're losing the Cold War. We're losing the Cold War. And this will help fuel the conservative revival. Détente was actually making things less safe. And this would help bring Ronald Reagan, who threatened to stop communism everywhere, including Central America. So, there were 2 assassination attempts on Gerald Ford. And I just put these up to give you an idea how volatile the 70s were. There were a couple thousand terrorist attacks in the 1970s. There's a heck of a lot more terrorist attacks in the 70s than in the early 2000s. It was all over the place. Squeaky Frost, who is part of Charles Manson's family. Some of you might know who Charles Manson was. She was not part of the mass murder that Manson's family committed. But here she was. She tried to assassinate Ford. And then a month later, Sarah Jane Moore, a middle-aged woman who wanted to become a radical and join the Black Panthers, she thought, they wanted nothing to do with her, tried to shoot President Ford, and that's him. Seconds after the shot was fired, they're trying to push him into the limousine. He was not hit, but it just seemed to show how that the feeling was that the political structure of the United States was kind of falling apart. You gotta admit, Sweetie Frog's outfit's pretty cool. She just got out of prison. She got out on parole 4 years ago. So maybe get her as a guest speaker. She supposedly, I think she did her time. So in 76, a bicentennial year, you have a presidential election where you have everything tainted by Watergate in Vietnam. And you have Gerald Ford running again, now to win on his own right, and an absolute unknown by the name of Jimmy Carter. He was an outsider and ran on it, running against government corruption. He promised he would never lie to the American public, which by definition is a lie. And he figured out the new campaign of primaries and caucuses. And even though he's governor of Georgia, he basically just ran from 74 to 76. The joke was Jimmy who. And yet, this honest appearing, hardworking person got the Democratic nomination over much more popular and well-known characters. He was a peanut broker, bought and sold peanuts, as a commodity. So he could sell himself as a small Georgia peanut farmer from a little town called Plains, who became governor and a man you can trust as president. And so that's the peanut. He was known for an infectious grin. He's an interesting guy. But presidency would be unsuccessful. This is a bank. I had one of these. A peanut bank for Jimmy Carter's campaign. The only problem was, it was one of those banks that didn't have a way to get the money in. You could put the money in, but the only way to get the money out was literally to cut it in half. And I put like $2 in change in it, and I decided I needed that. And that's back when, you can get a candy bar, which were bigger back then, for a quarter. Where they now like $3 at a gas station. And I cut it up and got my $2 out to go buy a candy bar and a can of pop, probably for 25 cents too. And now they sell for like $300 on eBay. I know, I could have retired on the $300. Carter was what they called the New Democrats. And the Democrats decided that the old working class New Deal coalition had to be changed. They ran away from the successes of the New Deal, which is shocking because Social Security was so popular. They also ran away against labor unions, thinking they'll get these new urban professionals in cities and run against the working class. I should add, failed miserably for Democrats. And even though the term wouldn't be around for another decade, Carter was the first of the Democrats who was a neoliberal, meaning much more conservative economically, believing the market could solve things. Will this work for Democrats? No. It will be a dismal disaster, but they really won't see it totally implode until 1994. So Jimmy Carter would win a huge victory. And if you'll notice something, two things. First off, remember this, the South was switching over. This is the last election. The Democrats won. Guy from Georgia won the South. And he won in 1980. Also, you might notice, see California. California was a very Republican state. Let me get the last couple things in really quick. Star Wars came. 3 Mile Island. There was a near nuclear meltdown on 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. And this pretty much ended all nuclear power in the United States. Any new nuclear power. Nuclear power plants are incredibly expensive, and yes, they are dangerous. But they just quit doing it. And so now there's talk about rebuilding, but they're so expensive, so much more expensive than natural gas, which is a lot more expensive than solar or wind, but we don't